themselves, the planets and this earth, observe degree, priority and place, office and custom in all line of order. Take but degree away, untune that string, and hark what discord follows.
Hello friends, this is Silvina Barna. Welcome to Green Shakespeare. Today we will be discussing eco-criticism, a fairly recent school of literary and cultural criticism, which has been expanding its horizons and proliferating, finding fertile soil where to plant its seeds in a world that is increasingly concerned about ecology. So, for those of you who have never heard the term, you might be wondering what eco-criticism means, what it entails. Well, it emerged in the USA in the late 1980s, especially in the West, and in the UK in the early 1990s, where it is known as green studies. Since its beginnings, eco-critics have been struggling to define the concepts and have found themselves immersed in heated debates about what constitutes nature, for instance. Since then, they have gone a long way. Its theoretical framework has developed impressively. Donna Haraway, for example, coined the term nature cultures to show that the conventional binary opposition, nature versus culture, is not actually real. It is rather a continuum. So you might be wondering, what is the task of eco-critics? What is the value it has for us as readers and dwellers of this earth? In the field of literature, eco-critics focus their reading on the representation of the natural world in literature and the interconnectedness between the human and the non-human elements in it. The impact of this approach is incredible because it makes us see outside ourselves and reflect on the collective responsibility of our interactions with everything that surrounds us. Our discussion today centers on eco-criticism and Shakespearean studies. Several scholars have been exploring this new approach to Shakespeare in the recent years. Gabriel Egan published a collection of essays under the title Green Shakespeare in 2006. There he reminds us that eco-criticism is a presentist school of thought. The theory presented there works as long as readers are capable of thinking with Shakespeare about our present ecological predicament. Lynn Bruckner, in her article Reading Shakespeare in the Ecotone, also points in that direction by highlighting the potential of enlisting Shakespeare's cultural capital in the struggle to address our current ecological crisis. Simon Eastock proposed the paradigm of ecophobia in Shakespeare, which he understands as the breaking of the bonds with nature. He incorporates theoretical notions of feminism, queer theory, critical racial theory, food studies, cultural anthropology, eco-psychology, post-structuralism, and deconstruction. The growth of this original and absolutely meaningful approach to Shakespeare proves what Stanley Cavell referred to in his article, The Interminable Shakespearean Text. The multivocality of the bard never ceases to surprise us. Today we will talk to a group of researchers from Universidad del Salvador in Buenos Aires, Argentina. They have been studying Shakespeare's works from an eco-critical perspective since 2015, and they will tell us about their projects, what they have been studying recently, and their vision of eco-criticism, and what it means for them as South Americans and Argentinians in the current global context. Welcome. Our guests today are Malvina Aparicio, PhD in Modern Languages and Chair of English Literature in this university, Marcela Gallegos, a graduate from this institution and current professor of History of the British Isles, and Guadalupe García and Laura Calderón, former students of this institution as well, and actresses. What can you tell us about your research experience so far?
In our project, we study Shakespeare's works with the ecocritic approach, but you may ask, what is ecocriticism? It is a field of literary study that explores the relationship between nature and literature, and we study not only the way in which the environment is represented, but also how characters interact with it. Shakespeare is the poet of nature. T.F. Thistleton Dyer says in Folklore of Shakespeare, his attention was not confined to the actions of men. He was an exact surveyor of the inanimate world. His descriptions have always some peculiarity, gathered by contemplating things as they really exist. Whether life or nature be his subject, Shakespeare shows plainly that he has seen with his own eyes.
So, how would you define ecocriticism?
I'm content with Cheryl Glotfelty's definition of ecocriticism as the study of the relationship between literature and the physical environment, an earth-centered approach to literary studies. It's large enough to cover the development of the discipline in different directions and connect with other disciplines as well. Shakespeare is eminently suited to be approached from the perspective of ecocriticism, in the first place because he's often called a country boy, and ecocriticism is mostly related to nature and everything natural. Of course, the connection is made from its very name that begins with the prefix eco, bringing forth the word ecology associated with nature. So in English texts, you often find the word green as in green studies. But as Lawrence Buell contends, there's a case to be made for urban ecology and therefore for urban criticism as well. Yet the case remains that Shakespeare opens up a universe of meaning when we go from metaphor to literal reference, and we take a word such as hawk, for example, and at the sight of the raptor, at his flight, at his sudden dive to catch his prey, we simultaneously capture, so to speak, the emotion, the complexity of emotions elicited by the action of the creature, and we experience in a poem such as The Rape of Lucrece what Shakespeare's words are doing when he compares Tarquin, the rapist, to a hawk in action.
When I'm asked what ecocriticism is, the most simple definition that comes to my mind is, well, ecocriticism is the study of the relationship between literature and the physical environment, as Cheryl Glotfelty defines. It's an earth-centered approach to literature in contrast to a man-centered approach. Nature is not just the setting where the story develops or the representation of a character's state of mind. Nature is what it is. Nature is a storm, a moor, the smell of flowers, and not what the character feels, what is inside him. An echo-centered reading concentrates on the outside. And then, well, there is the analysis of how nature is represented in this or that poem, or how environmental studies can contribute to literary studies. As ecocriticism brings about a transformation in the analysis of the world, it also focuses on the cultural processes that are inevitably related to nature.
Why do you think Shakespeare's works are open to this approach?
I guess that Shakespeare is so rich that you can do absolutely anything with it, and it will survive it. So I think that it's open to this approach specifically because it's full of images of nature, and sometimes it seems that nature is another important character in the play. In plays like A Midsummer Night's Dream or in The Tempest, it's very, very clear that nature plays a major role. But also in other plays, like, well, right now we are working on Titus Andronicus, and you can also find elements where the non-human plays a big role, and it's a very important element that allows for multiple interpretations.
There is something else in eco-criticism for us, non-English speakers of the language, either students or actors. Indeed, we come from a totally different cultural background, and while this implied in the past that we had to start by reliving, in a way, all the British tradition in order to respond the way English speakers did, this became increasingly time-wasting and politically complicated, to say the least. Yet there's also the issue of being faithful to the poet and choosing wisely how to articulate his artistic production in ways both meaningful and authentic for the Spanish-speaking River Plate students and audiences. That's where we think the eco-critical approach allows us to retrieve Shakespeare's human experience and supreme art in an untranslated form, directly, while we hear his translated words.
What are you all working on at the moment? Which texts are you tackling?
Right now, I've just finished working with The Rape of Lucrece, where I've worked not only with the eco-critic approach, but also with the ecofeministic approach. Lucrece undergoes Tarquin's control and abuse, which deprives her of her humanity and turns her into an it. Tarquin wants to possess Lucrece, leading him to trespass Colatine's property. He pollutes another man's territory. Through her body, Lucrece retrieves her dignity and prevents Rome's doom.
At the moment, I'm revisiting Richard III and its recreation in the BBC film The Hollow Crown Richard III. I'm specifically studying forests, forest as a setting of the supernatural, as a cathartic place for the three widows. You know that the three wailing queens meet in a wood as an echo of the three witches in Macbeth. You can see a sordid Margaret in ragged clothes, abandoned, a complete mess. She's in a fatal state, and she turns up from the forest. And then, holding hands with the Duchess and Elizabeth, they join. These opposing figures, as they have always been, have now a common purpose, which is Richard's death. So, this wood space, which lacks a civilized system, a space which has no social organization, is the perfect place for these women to express their griefs. So wilderness, untouched by civilization, wilderness as a cathartic area for the outcast, with no man-made structures, as a place of myth, is the eco-critical aspect of Richard III I'm tackling at the moment.
My latest paper deals with Titus Andronicus, and the eco-critical element I find in it is violence. Of course, violence is in many plays, and it's we can say it's a cliche topic in Titus Andronicus, but what I like about it, or what's interesting about it for me, is the two different ways of exercising violence. What I do is to compare Tamara's way and Titus' way. So violence is an inherent force of nature, and as such is also present within ourselves, no matter how much our culture has tried to repress that. Yes, so violence is still within us, but we can find a human way of controlling it or administering it for a greater good, or we can let ourselves loose in its flow, in its energy, for our self-interests and for our self-preservation in the more animal way. So we have those two ways of acting violently. Yes, it's either for a greater good or for self-preservation in in which case we would be moving and behaving at the level of the animal species, becoming men-beast. So I find that interesting. I find how easy it is to become non-human. And what I see in Titus Andronicus is that following Frankel's logotherapy, what happens basically with Titus, in my opinion, is that his meaning in life is taken away from him. But I see that all his animal energy that was restrained in his love for Rome is all of a sudden unleashed. And that makes him really, really dangerous. And what I like about this is that I find it very contemporary, because at least in Argentina, in the 21st century Argentina, there's a lot of violence. People react violently whenever they feel threatened by a certain idea or by a certain ideology. They just attack in the most violent way, in the most non-human way, the different ideas or different speakers, and I think that's also happening worldwide.
I'm working at present with Titus Andronicus, Antony and Cleopatra, and Coriolanus. All three share a common concern with violence, how it breaks out, how it might have been quelled, how central it is in the life of men, and what it does to them, to us, when we experience it. Also how natural it is, whether it is a necessity or is willfully brought about. These questions stem from the fact that ecocriticism is not content with the traditional unraveling of a given discourse, clever as the exercise might be, but is intent on bringing about good practices, change of attitudes, overcoming ignorance, prejudice, ecophobia. And this is why it turns out to be so relevant in present-day Buenos Aires, plagued by violence of all kinds.
What activities have you carried out so far, and what are your plans for the future?
So far we have been offering conferences and workshops. This podcast is also very, very important to share our ideas. And someday I hope that we can put all these on stage, stage a play with an ecocritical approach.
Up to now, we have held some workshops and published a few papers in Shakespeare conferences and specialized mags with mixed reactions. Some were interested, some were indifferent.
The objective of our Shakespearean research team is to appropriate the bot's narrative on our own terms. I think that this project makes Shakespeare's work available for our people, for the people in our own century, as we are working in order to make it easier for people to approach his epic.
On a final auspicious note, our university has just created the Department of Shakespearean Studies at the School of Modern Languages on April 23rd last, bringing thus to fruition one of our most constantly pursued objectives ever since the Shakespeare research team came into existence. Our overall project is to contribute with something alive to academia, something that can attract young people to research activities, for instance, at an early stage in their careers, which means really to attract young people to adopt a serious questioning attitude and step aside from the rut, to find out their own vital questions in a text which, by its distance both in place and time, does not raise immediate controversy of the Twitter type, but becomes a natural way for decision-making, for tackling reality as they see it, and finding their own answers.
Would you say the experience of reading Shakespeare in this different light has changed you in any way?
I do not find any change in me. Maybe it's a question for others to answer, but I can tell you something. After immersing myself in ecocriticism for some time now, I reread certain texts, Kafka's Metamorphoses, for example, and I have found in my heart a place for beetles. How unfair I was being with insects, how ecophobic I was. Now, rather than crushing them, I pick them up and throw them delicately through the window instead.
Thank you all for being with us today. Your valuable insights have been very inspiring. You've proven that the scope of eco-criticism, as the universe itself, tends to infinitude. And you've made us see Shakespeare in a different light. An approach like this one makes his works more accessible to a contemporary readership, and I sincerely hope that you can go through with your plans of staging an eco-critical performance of one of his plays. To close our episode, Laura Calderón will recite Sonnet 98 for us. I hope it speaks to your eco-critical hearts. Thanks for joining us.
Sonnet 98. From you have I been absent in the spring, when proud-pied April, dressed in all his stream, hath put a spirit of youth in everything, that heavy satin laughed and leaped with him. Yet nor the lace of birds, nor the sweet smell of different flowers in odor and in hue, could make me any summer story tell, or from their proud lap pluck them where they grew. Nor did I wonder at the lilies white, nor praise the dipped vermilion in the rose. They were but sweet, but figures of delight, drawn after you, you, pattern of all those. Yet seemed it winter still, and you away, as with your shadow I with these did play.